The anime begins with our protagonist, Vanille Fertile, who is reincarnated in another world after dying from overwork. Now, in this new world, he finds himself in the body of a 2-year-old child and possesses the memories of the previous owner of the body. When he meets his maid, she is surprised to see that he can speak fluently. Ivan mentions the names of his family members, which leaves the maid even more shocked. At one point, however, he asks where they are located. Sometime later, while everyone is eating, we meet the rest of his family, the third son, Sesto, the middle child, and Arda, the eldest, along with Mercia, and the head of the family and Marquis, Jalpa. The atmosphere at the table is quite tense, except for little Van, who is very rude to the servants. His father asks what tasks each one has for the day, and his children, a bit nervous, share their duties. When it is Van's turn, he responds that, in fact, he doesn't know, as there are many things to do, but he is interested in learning about the culture and history of that nation. His siblings are surprised to hear him, while the father bursts into laughter. He is impressed to see that, at just 2 years old, Van is someone extraordinary, and makes it clear that with him, the future of the family is secure. The Marquis also expresses anticipation for Van's magical aptitude test when he turns 8, as he expects great things from him. It is then explained that in that world, there is magical aptitude, something essential that the nobility must master. The elemental attacks of earth, water, wind, and fire are fundamental to protect the people. Those who possess aptitude for other elements are considered a disgrace. Van's father and brothers have aptitude for the 4 elements. Sometime later, Van begins to ask the maid about things in that world and discovers that there are other races, such as elves and dwarves. Furthermore, there are also magical minerals capable of storing energy, just like my power, meaning this is magic. However, they are interrupted by the house butler, who asks Van if he still remembers the things he has learned. Van replies that sometimes he forgets some characters, but who still remembers well what he studied so far. Espada tests him by asking what 3 + 2 is. Van gets a little nervous, as that frightening butler intimidates him, but he answers correctly. Espada then says that from now on, he will be responsible for his tutoring, and thus begins the infernal lessons. Van is bombarded with studies, but thanks to this, he quickly learns to read and write in just a week. Of course, he learns to read and write in that world, meaning a completely different writing system. Thus, 2 years pass under Espada's tutelage, and now, at 4 years old, his fencing lessons begin. A maid named Tio ends up humiliating him beautifully, and he, embarrassed, goes after her. However, the other maids stop her and warn Tio that she is risking her own life by mocking the young master, as mocking a noble is a serious crime. They ask Van to punish her, while Tio nervously squeezes her buttocks. However, Van only gives her a light tap on the head as a reprimand. The other maids say that this is not enough, but Van replies that it's enough for him. Thus, a year passes practicing fencing, and upon turning 5, he can already fight on equal terms with older military children, proving to be much superior. After all, they are just children, and their attacks are quite predictable. The most surprising thing for everyone, however, is how Van manages to relate to common people, unlike his brothers who look down on everyone. While resting, the sub-commander approaches and asks to see his hands. Upon observing them, he is surprised that there are no calluses, as he imagined Van trained until nightfall. Van then explains that studying too much leaves him exhausted. Dai reveals that, according to rumors, Espada wants him to study 3 times more than others. Van cannot believe it, yet Dai warns him that if he wants to learn more about fencing, he can talk to Espada, as that old man is very stubborn. Dee believes the young lord should dedicate himself to the art of the sword, and he would personally take charge of making him the best swordsman in the kingdom. Van replies that he likes both things, so he will continue to strive. But he says he will personally train him and assures that he won't push him too hard since he is still a child. However, Van knows perfectly well that this is a lie. When the personalized lessons begin, he discovers that Dai is another demon who trains him all day long and, during breaks, commands him to stay in a guard position to rest and train at the same time. This guy is not just a demon, he's also an idiot. Uncle takes it upon himself to comfort him while Van thinks that, although the days are exhausting, the truth is that he has fun every day since he was reincarnated. The damned Dai starts dancing while Van thinks that he will live and enjoy this new life to the fullest. Thus, another year passed, and now, at 6 years old, everyone starts calling him a prodigy. However, so many fencing lessons and studies are practically wearing him out. So, he decides to sneak out to the market with Tila since he plans to become a bum. At the market, he asks about a large infrastructure, and Uncle explains that it is the Great Mari Company, a huge trading enterprise with branches throughout the kingdom. However, the moment is interrupted by a man dragging a tied-up child. Upon noticing that they are watching, he asks what the hell they want. The soldiers take a guard position because he has disrespected the young lord, but Van stops them and asks why he is taking the boy tied up. The man replies that he can do whatever he wants with his own son, and that he is taking him to sell him as a slave. Uncle explains that poor families sell their children as slaves when they cannot support them in order to survive. At this moment, a young brunette with reddish hair is surprised to recognize Van as the son of the Marquis. He wonders how she found out, but understands everything when Uncle shows the cloak. The girl introduces herself as Rosalie and invites them to enter the company to buy anything they desire. The man from before panics upon discovering that Van belongs to the Marquise's family. Van then asks Rosalie how much she would give that guy for the boy as a slave. She observes him and asks the boy's father about his magical aptitude. The man replies that his son has a knack for theft, which means he isn't worth even 3 hefty silver coins. Furious, the man lunges at the boy, saying that he is practically worthless. Rosalie asks what the hell he is doing with his own son, but the man tells her not to interfere. At that moment, Van intervenes and offers to buy the boy for 5 hefty silver coins. The uncle hands over the money, and the man leaves immediately. Van approaches the boy, introduces himself, and frees him. When he asks the boy's name. The boy says his name is Kumsim. Van tells him that he is now free and can go wherever he wants. However, noticing that Kumsim has nowhere to go, he asks if he would like to come with him to the mansion. One of the guards warns that he seriously doubts the Marquis would allow him in unless he were brought as a slave. Van laments the situation and asks Kumsim if he would accept to follow him in that capacity. Kumsim replies that he would. Before buying clothes for him, Rosalie handles the slavery contract. The mark appears on Kumsim's hand, and Rosalie explains that it will remain as long as the contract is active. She also informs Van that, since this is his first visit, she will let this go for free. Van thanks her, and Rosalie, surprised that a noble expressed gratitude, runs off. Over time, Kumsim begins to live peacefully in the mansion, working for Van. At one point, he mentions that the sub-commander D is looking for him. Van gives him a cookie as a bribe to keep quiet about his whereabouts, but Kumsim replies that he should already know. Van asks about his gloves, and Kumsim says he doesn't mind showing the bond with his master. However, upon learning that Van bought them especially for him, he puts them on immediately. Hearing that D is coming, he quickly leaves the room, saying that Van is not there. Even so, D notices the crumbs on Kumsim's face and realizes that Van bribed him. After some discussion, D decides to take Kumsim to train him in Van's place. Van apologizes to Kumsim, and thus the years continue to pass. When Van finally turns 8, the moment of the magical aptitude exam arrives. The entire kingdom is anxious for the result, but on the day of the exam, everything turns dark. Upon discovering that Van has no aptitude for any magical element, he has only an aptitude for production magic, considered the most pathetic of all, since it serves only to create swords or jewelry, things that can already be made without magic. With such weak magic, he wouldn't be able to protect the people. His father declares that he is a disappointment, and that it was a mistake to place so many hopes in him. The Marquis holds the sword, and Van panics, wondering what the hell he should do. At the last moment, however, his brother intervenes. The father asks what he thinks he's doing, and Mercia replies that on the border of the Marquisate, there is a village that, due to its location, has never been able to develop. Mercia suggests that it would be best to send Van there. The village has only about 100 inhabitants and lacks special products. To the north, there are mountains rich in resources, but inhabited by large magical beasts. Furthermore, the region borders the county of Ferdinand, and on the other side, the enemy kingdom, with Elenita serving only for occasional military exercises. The father understands that this is a newly annexed territory, whose loyalty is still fragile, and that sending someone from the family could yield good results. Thus, he informs Van that he entrusts him with the lordship of that village and that he must leave as soon as he is ready. He then congratulates Mercia for finding a good use for that useless one. When the father and the other brothers leave, Mercia apologizes to Van, saying that he couldn't bear to see him suffer and that's why he made such an absurd proposal. Van replies that, thanks to him, he didn't die. Mercia tells him not to worry, and that even if it isn't much, he will do everything in his power to help him. And the next day, Aunt is furious because, even though her little lord has no aptitude for magic, he remains someone very wise and admirable to her. It is a terrible injustice that he is exiled to a remote village. Van responds that she doesn't need to worry, for in fact, he is excited. This way, he will have more free time and can still shape that village as he wants, living a peaceful and happy life. He watches the loading of his luggage and realizes that they didn't give him an official escort. However, his brother Mukria hired 10 adventurers to protect him during the journey. Van feels very grateful to Mukria at this moment. Tila rushes to him and warns that she is his personal maid and intends to go along. And it's not just her. Dee also decides to accompany him to continue teaching him the art of the sword. Although Van would prefer him to stay, he is surprised because, theoretically, they shouldn't have assigned knights to accompany him. However, Dee doesn't mind at all and tells Arte and Louis to get ready. And it doesn't stop there. Espada also decides to join him, saying that he has decided to expedite his retirement since his successor is ready, and he prefers to spend his old age supervising Van's education. Van can't believe it. Thus, he sets off on his journey, thinking that everything would be quite quiet since his father didn't want anyone to know that he had been exiled. However, along the way, a girl asks why he is leaving. Van asks how she found out, and she points to the grand farewell they are having. Arte explains that these are the orders of Sub-Commander D, as he thought it was a shame for Van to leave the city so discreetly, and that the least they could do was give him a dignified farewell. Van remembers that his father ordered nothing to be revealed, but Arte replies that the problem is that Lord D ended up falling asleep, and, when he wakes up, they will tell him to take down the banners. However, Van sees the damn Dai shouting his farewell, loudly, while Argo, embarrassed, strategically leaves. Thus, Van leaves the kingdom in the best way possible, surrounded by the affection of all the citizens. On the way to Van's territory, he picks up a branch and transforms it into a small sword, shocking the others. Kanjim asks if that is production magic. Van confirms, saying that he wanted to test it a little and hopes it will be useful for something. At this moment, they arrive at the village. Van comments that if Kanjim gets tired of life there's no problem going back to the Marquis's house, as the slavery contract can be cancelled. He also says that he will ask his brother Mukria to take care of him. Kanjim immediately refuses, stating that he will not leave and that he will always be by Van's side to protect him. Suddenly, the carriage stops. Van, worried, asking what is happening, Arby replies that the village is being attacked. Everyone disembarks from the carriage and begins a meeting to decide what to do. Dai believes the enemies are either a gang of bandits or a group of former mercenaries, as they appear to have combat experience. Van notices that, despite the village being surrounded, the arrows fly calmly over the fence. In front of the gates, there are tough men, roughly 50 in number, and he asks Van for permission to enter the battle, saying that if they work together, they might be able to win. An adventurer immediately objects, claiming they are too few in number. Dai admits it will be dangerous, and that there will likely be casualties, but believes they can confront the enemies. Again, the adventurer opposes, stating he was hired only to escort Van to the village and not to enter a war where his group could be killed. He asks if he could at least protect Van if things go out of control, as the knights will attack alone. The adventurer agrees, but Espada goes against this idea, saying that if D dies, the future of the village will be precarious. Espada comments that he is a mage of the 4 elements and explains his plan. First, he will build a barrier, and the adventurers must attack from a distance behind it. When the enemy focuses on them, Dai and his men will attack from the side. Van asks if Espada really intends to fight, which the butler confirms, saying that if he does not continue the attack behind the right barrier, the criminals will manage to kill Dai and the knights. Van says that in that way, Espada will end up dying, but the old man responds that it is an honor to serve at the end of his life. Still, Van knows that if Espada and D die there, he will have no chance of developing the territory, not to mention that his father, the Marquis, will probably kill him. Then Van asserts that it will be his role to serve as bait. He despairs and immediately refuses. Kanjim says he will take Van's place, but he refuses and declares that he will assume that role, as he receives intensive training from the captain of the knights every day and will not die easily. Even if that happens, it is the lord of the land's duty to die for his people. Furthermore, since he will not reveal his name, this will not cause problems for the Marquise's family. We then see a flashback in which Orto, the leader of the group of adventurers, complains about having to escort a rich noble, saying that there is no decent person among the nobles, as they all discriminate against commoners and adventurers. His companions ask why he accepted the mission, and he replies that he planned to stay in the ugly Marquise's territory for a while, and had no choice but to accept. At that moment, Van appears, greets the adventurers, and thanks them for accepting the escort. As he leaves, he thanks them again, making Orto comment that, in rare cases, a decent noble appears. Returning to the present, Orto steps forward and says they have left their lives in Van's hands, which confuses him. The adventurer explains that a child is risking his life, and if he does nothing, his companions will be furious with him. Pluriel comments that he has always mocked the determination of nobles, as they only know how to talk. But Van is different, and therefore they will trust him. Passing by Van, D says that they are the knights serving the Marquise's house, and that by protecting Van, they are protecting the future of the Marquise family's lineage. Espada comments that he cannot accept such an irresponsible tactic and says that after everything calms down, Van will need to deeply understand the weight of the responsibility of being a candidate for future Marquis. He then modifies the plan. He will create a barrier and attack from a distance, while Dai and his men will go left and the adventurers will go right. Espada quickly creates a barrier of earth, leaving Orto impressed with the speed, as he didn't imagine he was a mage of that caliber. One of his companions comments that if Espada didn't agree to fight alongside the young master, he would do so in his place. Orto thinks that if Van becomes the next leader of the family, it would be a very good thing, as he is a decent noble. The bandits continue shooting arrows, commenting that it will be easy until one of them is hit by an arrow from behind. They realize that the attack is coming from behind a wall that wasn't there when they arrived. The leader orders them to attack the people behind the wall. But as they advance, he says that he appears from the left, decimating the enemies, while Orto comes from the right, doing the same. The attack becomes increasingly intense, and the bandits realize they are being cornered. The adventurers and knights continue to eliminate the enemies until Dai shows up with a threatening aura and says that those who wish to die may step forward. The bandits panic and start to flee. The leader quickly moves behind the walls to defeat the mages, and Orto asks someone to stop him. Pluriel gets scared upon seeing the enemy, but when he tries to attack her, Van appears, dodging the attack and injuring him from behind. Kanchim advances and delivers the final blow. Van then orders everyone to stay alert, leaving Pluriel shocked, wondering what kind of child he really is. Upon finishing, he mentions that they managed to reduce the enemy without suffering any casualties, achieving the best possible outcome. Now, all that's left is to collect the payment to complete the job. At that moment, the purple elf Pluriel asks if something is wrong with him. He simply replies that he feels a bit curious, and everyone imagines this is due to the boy Van. He confirms this and makes a proposal. Although they don't earn much money, he thinks about staying in that place. This leaves everyone pondering. Then, one of them apologizes, saying he already has another contract to fulfill. He says not to worry and hopes they can meet again in the future. Thus, they bid farewell to the rest of the adventurers, although Pluriel decides to stay too, saying that Van saved her life and she needs to repay the favor. The others who stayed comment on how incredible it is that he is only 10 years old, and everyone agrees, also saying that he is the only noble they really like. Everyone is eager to see what kind of domain the boy will build, and then decides to help him for a bit longer. Just at that moment, the uncle appears scolding Van for putting himself in danger, and our protagonist apologizes. Shortly after, Dai also arrives, exclaiming that the victory was formidable and congratulates him on the job. Espada approaches, warning that the villagers have gathered at the entrance. Van thanks them and, as he approaches the gate, mentions that it's time for his presentation. Upon entering, they realize the village is large, but they also notice how everyone is very frail and extremely thin due to hunger. Here, we meet Honda, the chief of the village, who thanks them for saving him once again. Van is confused and asks if this has happened before. Honda confirms and explains that the reason is that they used to belong to Count Ferdinand, and the knights patrolled the area. However, this stopped happening once they came under the Marquis Fertile. Aware of this, Van apologizes on behalf of his father. He explains that he was not yet aware of the situation of the smaller villages. In light of this, Honda asks if that means that since they pay little taxes, it's not worth protecting them. Van says that complaining solves nothing, which irritates one of the villagers, but he clarifies that he is talking about the future of the village. While the nobles have great responsibilities, the real problem lies with the laws imposed by the Belle Rene royal family. However, they cannot change the kingdom's laws, at least not for now, so they have to seek solutions. Van proposes 3 concrete measures. The first is to give the village a value that the kingdom cannot ignore. The second is to earn money and hire mercenaries. And the third is to remodel and develop the village. A woman intervenes, saying they have already thought about this, but it's not easy at all. Van reassures her, saying that now they have him as their new lord. Obviously, the reaction is not the best. Then, to support Van, Espada introduces himself as the former head butler of the Marquise's household and claims that Van is a genius. Dai also introduces himself as the sub-commander of the Knights of Fertile. This cheers up Chief Honda, who asks the protagonist if that means he has mastery over the 4 elements. Ivan clarifies that he has the aptitude only for production magic. This causes their hopeful expressions to change to deep sadness, as this magic is considered the worst of all. And of course, this also discourages our little protagonist. Then, a villager asks about the taxes, as before they charge 30% of the harvests. Van responds that he will reduce it to 10% for a while. This relieves all the villagers. With that resolved, Van suggests starting to reinforce the walls and asks the sword if its earth magic lasts over time. The sword replies that it remains strong as long as it is active with its user. Once the user is done, it transforms back into a mound of earth. This is enough for Van, so he asks them to raise walls as a temporary measure. Everyone is surprised to see a wall being erected in a matter of seconds. Then, Van asks them to also make an effort to fend off invaders. The knights offer to take care of that task, and even say they will prepare traps and pits. Van thinks this is fantastic, and turning to the villagers, says that their cooperation will be essential for the village to be reborn stronger than ever. After that, our protagonist says he wanted to test his production magic a bit. He takes a piece of a log and concentrates. He makes heat slowly rise from the pit of his stomach, sending it to the tips of his fingers and visualizing each fiber of the wood, weaving them like a rope. He knows that the thinner they are, the more he can obtain a block of wood. The uncle asks what he just produced. Van replies that it is a block of fiber, something similar to nanofiber, a term they are unfamiliar with, so they make strange expressions. After a while, someone walks by and sees all the blocks that Van created. He picks one up and comments that it is very light but extremely hard, and asks if he can cut it. Van allows it, but when he tries to cut it, the person can only strike it and send it flying away. The cube remains intact, but ends up damaging a tree. Everyone is surprised by this, especially since the blow was strong enough to split a rock. This means Van achieved what he wanted. A few hours later, we see that Van has created even more cubes and even weapons. They ask if his mana has not run out yet, but he says he has not felt that depletion yet. He comments that production magic consumes so much mana that it is usually difficult to create even a single object. That's why it is considered useless. Out of pure curiosity, he creates a katana and notices that Kamshin is fascinated, and he decides to gift him. Then, he realizes that the uncle also seems to be expecting something and, as a clever man of few words, he ends up gifting a woman an axe. Yes, quite clever given the strange expression she makes. Van wonders if she doesn't like axes. The uncle pretends, saying it's a magnificent axe since she was delighted to see it. Van is happy that she liked it, but upon closer observation, thinks that next time he will make a prettier accessory for her. At night, he goes to rest and comments that his whole body aches from having slept outdoors throughout the journey, in addition to feeling dirty for not being able to take a bath. He knows that the uncle and Kumsim are pretending to be fine, but they are surely as tired as he is. Therefore, before reinforcing the defenses, he decides to ensure the basic needs are met. Thus, he makes the decision to build a house. The next day, everyone wakes up. The villagers see the cubes and ask what they are. Then, Van asks if they would mind him building a house in that area. The old man replies that lately the squares are hardly used, so he thinks the spot is ideal and perfect for his lord's mansion. Van thanks him and thinks to himself that once everything is more settled, he will organize festivals and carnivals. He then focuses on building the house, envisioning all the necessary parts, from the pillars and stakes in the ground to the walls and the roof. He then releases his magic and creates a mansion in a matter of seconds. This feat leaves everyone completely amazed by the house that has just been built. Everyone praises him and is left speechless. Van is glad that his production magic is useful for everyone, although he sincerely thinks the size of the house got a bit out of hand. Kumsim comments that Van's magic is much better for a landlord than the magic of the four elements. Van says that his magic is even interesting, but elemental magics are much better for protecting the people of the Bouei territory, as people living in an area protected by elemental magic feel safer. The uncle and Kumsim immediately disagree, commenting that they would rather live in Van's city than in Jalpa. He doesn't quite believe them, for they are very biased. Sword says that Van is right, for in times of war he would not be able to protect his people. However, the people want a lord who can improve their lives, and in that regard, there is no one better than Van. Even Dai agrees, commenting that he never imagined Van could even build a house. The leader of the adventurers, Orto, states that Van's power far exceeds that of a common production magic. Van mentions that if they bring wood, he will build a house for them. This leaves both shocked, and they call their subordinates to gather wood, as they cannot miss this opportunity. The village chief asks Van if he could also build a house for the villagers, as the houses are in a deplorable state. Some comment that the rain enters their houses and that some don't even have floors. Our protagonist thinks that doing everything at once will be tiring, but reflects that the village really needs a drastic renovation. He then tells the villagers that he will build houses for everyone and thinks that if his production magic can make everyone happy, then that is what he will do. He starts renovating the houses. Uncle explains that the houses were previously deteriorated and it was difficult to live in them, but now they are as good as new. Dai is shocked not only by the amount of magical power Van possesses, but also by the knowledge he has to build mansions and houses like those. Van explains that it is a grid design, basically 4 houses grouped with wide streets arranged in a grid pattern. The houses for the village families were designed to be uniform, so there would be no differences between them. He says that for now it is good, but when they have better quality stones, he will renovate everything. The villagers are extremely grateful and give him some things. Later, he builds a simple bathhouse next to his mansion, and all the women of the village are happy to hear about it. He constructed the bathtub and asked Pluriel to fill it with water magic, while he asked Kansum to heat the water with firewood, naming the place Bath. Goemon asks Van to take off his clothes and bathe with them, but he immediately refuses, saying that he is old enough to bathe alone. He says he never imagined that he and the villagers would be treated with such luxury. The maid comments that Van is that kind of person. The mage says she is really surprised, as he is a rare noble and an incredible child. This triggers Van's fan mode, so she starts talking non-stop about how Van has been amazing since he was a baby, and how he earned the title of child prodigy. At night, Van is relaxing in the bath and comments that, yes, he gained muscles, but he still looks very skinny compared to Dai. Van remarks that anyone looks skinny next to Dai. At that moment, Dee arrives with all the knights to take a bath. Van tries to escape, but Dai holds him back, saying that they will train in the bath. After that, Van goes to his room and sleeps after a tiring day. The next day, the knights create a moat. Ivan imagines that if they fill it with water, it would be great for the city's defense, as well as providing drinking water and water for bathing. Immediately, they start working to take water from the river and bring it to the village. Espada, with his earth magic, drills dozens of meters at once, while the others dig by hand. Dai looks like a tractor. Meanwhile, Van strengthens the ground and the walls and is shocked by Dai's energy. Espada comments that he is already 40 years old and still full of energy. Uncle thinks that the distance from the river to the village is quite large, so it will take a lot of work, but since they cannot live without water, it's the only way. Van thinks that if the environment and living conditions there improve, it will attract traders, which will be necessary for living there in the future. However, since this work will take at least a week, there's no point in thinking about it now. Even so, in the afternoon, they can already see the village. Ivan is shocked, thinking it was ridiculously fast. Ending the day there, Dai doesn't understand why. As if they keep going like this, they would reach the village in just a few hours. However, the assistants are already at their limit, struggling just to remain standing. Dee and Espada comment that they wanted to continue, but since the team can't go on anymore, it's fine to stop there. Van is shocked to see that the two still have energy to continue, thinking they are both monsters. The next day, everything is ready. Van thanks everyone for their cooperation, saying that they certainly went through tough times in the last day and a half. But thanks to this, they can now have water in the village. He gives the order to the sword, who removes the stone that was blocking the way. Water starts to gush out and everyone is amazed. Shortly after, the whole effort is filled with water. Van comments that if it rains, the water level could rise and flood the village, and he asks the sword if it would be better to build a lake. The butler confirms, saying they can use the lake as a reservoir for a future drought. So, they build a lake behind the village. The uncle is amazed, as a village that didn't even have a stream of water now has a lake that serves as a reservoir. The village chief thanks Van because, thanks to him, they no longer need to go to the river to fetch water. Van is happy to be able to change the lives of people. That night, on a road, inside a carriage, a little girl named Alte wakes up and Panamera asks if she is okay, stroking her hair. Alte says she is fine and thanks Panamera for being so nice to her. The two play inside the carriage, and then Panamera asks her to rest, as there is still a long way to go before they reach the border village. The next day, Van focuses on the defense of the village, creating a wall. He explains that he combined earth and stone in the wall to make it as sturdy as concrete. Zara says that with such a wall, they will be safe, even if thieves appear. Van wants to make the place even safer, and creates several simple ballistas to reinforce the defense of the territory. He places shields in front to block enemy attacks, while still being able to shoot arrows. The uncle tells Van that his production magic can create practically anything, and that although the village is small, it looks like a fortified city. The sword comments that it no longer looks like a village, but rather a small fortress. Dee says that simple thieves would not be able to conquer the place, no matter how hard they tried, and adds that if Japa had noticed Van's power, the Marquis family would significantly grow with him as a lord or even as an assistant. The sword asks him not to speak that way, as the head of the family always placed greater importance only on the ability to fight. The knight tells the butler that just by observing him, you can already understand what Van is capable of, asserting that he has the ability to fight because he possesses more power than anyone else. Espada disagrees again, saying that Van's power is geared towards protection and is not suitable for attacking other countries. Dai responds that war is not just about soldiers facing each other. Van interrupts the discussion, saying that lamenting the circumstances does no good, and that they should do their best with what they have available, which shocks both of them, who agree, asserting that even if the territory is pushed to its limits, they can still come back stronger in the future. However, Espada interrupts him, asking him not to advise Van to go against the Marquis. At that moment, Van's stomach growls, interrupting the conversation. He eats and finds Uncle's food very good. She is relieved, as there were not many ingredients to prepare the meal. The butler comments that defense is important, but they need to find a stable source of income, since the only way to buy things there is through a vendor who appears only once a month. Van says he can take care of the construction of the houses and furniture for now, and that they can manage with the food from the village's crops. However, upon hearing the butler mention that they don't have ingredients to make Van's beloved sweets, he panics and asks for ideas on items they could sell. Campson suggests selling wooden blocks made by Van, but the idea is dismissed since only he can produce them. Uncle suggests hunting monsters and selling their materials, but that idea is also rejected since only adventurers can hunt monsters, and they need to think of something that truly comes from the village. This is how we now see them in the forest. Zara says she can't stand the fact that, apparently, Uncle and Campson love the gifts they received so much that they both refuse to get them dirty. Van gets annoyed, but the two justify themselves, saying that it is a family treasure. Realizing this, Van thanks them for valuing their gifts so much, but reminds them that they need to use them to be able to defend themselves. At that moment, Zara takes out a shield that is supposedly quite durable. Van asks Campson to try hitting it hard, even feeling a bit bad about it, seeing how weak the hit was. Zara asks him to do it again, but this time seriously. As she says this, she hears something fall to the ground. Turning around, she sees a piece of the broken shield lying on the floor. Realizing this, she starts to cry, saying that she hadn't even used the shield for the first time yet. Van reassures her, uses his magic, and mends the shield. Zara is surprised to see that it is now as good as new. Suddenly, Ordo asks for a moment with our protagonist. Approaching the minerals, he asks if they could buy all of it. He mentions that in that forest, at the foot of the Wolfbrook Mountains, there are many dangerous magical beasts, and that might be why they manage to extract rare minerals without needing to climb the mountain. Then, he shows that they have iron, copper, silver, gold, and even mithril. He questions why no one had extracted these minerals before. Then he clarifies that what he is about to say is just a supposition, but he believes it might be due to the distance and the area being hard to access, causing knights only to come and explore. Van understands that if they found these minerals here, the entire mountain range must be filled with resources. He asks if he can use the iron ore and receives permission. Thus, we see Van use his magic and transform it into a cube, explaining that, although he has melted it, he has not removed all the impurities, so he doesn't know how pure it is. The chubby guy in the group is impressed. He asks Van if he could create some swords. Our little protagonist agrees without hesitation, and Zara asks for a short sword and a long one. Immediately, Van begins his work, focusing on the thickness, and after a few seconds, he compresses the material to the maximum, thus creating a short sword. Then, Van prepares to create the long sword, following the same procedure, and after a few seconds, he finishes it. Seeing the finish of the blade and the hilt, Zara screams with excitement, and the others also ask the protagonist to make swords for them. Van feels nervous but agrees. Pluriel examines the sword and comments that it could be easily sold for a good price. Van is surprised by this. At that moment, they approach the mithril, highlighting how strange it is to have found it in the forest, as this might mean there is a dungeon nearby. They explain how important this would be, since if there were a dungeon, the village would be filled with people and goods. They add that dungeons are sources of national treasures, such as jewels and relics, which, by protocol, when a new dungeon is reported, the guild establishes a headquarters in the nearest village. Van is uncertain whether it is a good idea to inform them now, as he still doesn't have what is necessary to accommodate the guild's personnel. Furthermore, the neighboring country might invade them to seize the treasure. Floriel, confused, asks if they wouldn't send soldiers to protect them and confirm the existence of the dungeon. Orto confesses that he is merely a nuisance to the fertile family, and that if they realize that place has value, they would quickly expel him and send him away. In light of this, Pluriel suggests discovering the dungeon only after he has already made the village prosper. That way, it would be much harder for the Fertiles to interfere. After discussing this, Van orders his men to avoid the dungeon area while collecting resources. Seeing that they do this for him, Van expresses his deep gratitude. Returning to the village, Van and Uncle were walking through the streets when suddenly a villager comes running, shouting that a stampede of armored lizards is on the way. Immediately, Van orders to raise the drawbridge and close the gate. The villagers obey, terror-stricken behind the wall to prevent the creatures from crossing the Sao moat. Assuming the role of leader, Van stands firm and says he understands their fear and that they don't want to fight. That's precisely why everyone will fight together, because he knows he cannot protect them alone. He asserts that he needs everyone's help, and with great determination asks them to join forces to protect that village, which is also their home. But anyway, if you've made it this far and want the next part, comment the word dungeon to show that you reached the end. The villagers are motivated by Van's speech and vow to fight to their last breath to protect the village. Van tells them to go immediately to the wall and take their positions behind the ballistae. Kanchim informs that Orto and his group have gone out to hunt. Then someone needs to take charge of the situation. Ivan decides to go up with the rest of the citizens. However, his uncle grabs his arm, tears in his eyes. Ivan may not be a simp, but he doesn't want to hurt her either. He asks Dai to climb up to the wall and report the situation to him in real time, while Van stays on the ground giving orders. Dai accepts the mission and runs to the top of the wall, and the scene before him leaves him stunned. He warns Van that about 40 armored lizards are approaching, each approximately 8 meters tall, equivalent to 3 elephants stacked on top of each other. Free units of measurement, he begins to panic upon seeing this, as even a group of veteran knights struggles to take down a single armored lizard, and now they only have a handful of trained fighters. Van orders that they load iron arrows onto the giant crossbows, and Dai immediately moves ahead to carry out the order. The knights comment that normal weapons don't work against the armored lizard's tough scales, and Dai knows this. He says that so far he has won every battle he fought, but this time he will trust his instinct and let Van take command. He tells everyone to load the ballistae, and then orders them to fire. The arrows disappear as soon as they hit the lizards, and it takes a moment for Dai to realize there are huge holes exactly where the projectiles struck. The hit armored lizards fall to the ground a few seconds later, still propelled by the inertia of their own bodies. Soon, in the first volley, the villagers bring down 10 of them. Dai is impressed by the quality of the weapons made by Van, and also by the villagers, who for some reason are able to aim better than my teammates in ranked matches. He tells everyone to prepare for the second round, and the knights warn that there is only 1 iron arrow left for each ballista. Dai tells them to load and shoot anyway, and they manage to take down a few more armored lizards. However, half of the enemies are still standing and the ammunition has run out. G relays the situation to Van, who starts to think of a solution. Suddenly, he remembers. The wooden sword of Kantim managed to cut through the high-spec shield of the Fate, so just imagine that this might also work against the armored lizards, and tell Guy to use wooden arrows. The knights think this is pure stupidity, as wood shouldn't penetrate the skin of the lizards, tough as steel. Dai tells everyone to shut up, saying that Van has proven them wrong many times before, and this time he will trust what Van says. He orders the villagers to load the wooden arrows and shoot, and to everyone's surprise, even the wooden arrows manage to pierce the lizards, although they get stuck halfway through. Fortunately, that is already enough to hit their vital organs and kill them instantly. At that moment, Dai realizes that nobody can defeat them. He tells the villagers to load and shoot again, saying that tonight they will feast on lizard meat. The villagers obey and rain arrows down on the armored lizards, exterminating what remains of them. Dai proudly declares victory to Van, and the villagers start celebrating loudly. Uncle hugs Van tightly as he still tries to process the fact that his wooden weapons actually worked against such powerful monsters. At the top of the wall, the knights comment that no one on their side was injured, and that there's still plenty of ammo left. Dee thinks the battle ended too quickly and feels a bit disappointed, but it just shows how broken Van's ability is. Shortly after, the villagers begin processing the bodies of the lizards under the guidance of Ordo's group, which returned quite late. Ordo tells them to preserve the eyes, fangs, skin, and magical core for sale. As for the meat, it should be stored for consumption. He explains that usually processing armored lizards takes a lot of time, and that much of the meat rots before it can be used. But thanks to the knives made by Van, the work becomes very easy. At that moment, Van arrives, inspects the mountain of meat, and decides to organize a big feast to celebrate the victory. At night, the festivities begin, and people eat as much meat as they want. Orto's group talks with Van, and he says that the weapons he made work extremely well. He hears this and asks Van if he has ever made weapons for adventurers before him. Orto's group starts displaying their swords. Dai feels jealous when he sees this and asks Van to make a sword for him, saying he is willing to write a blank check. The other knights also want weapons made by Van, and he shyly replies that he cannot accept their money, but that he is a bit busy at the moment. He promises to craft new equipment as soon as the village's matters are settled, and the knights are satisfied with that. Then, Orto tells Van that usually an armored lizard sells for 20 gold coins, but since most of the meat will rot, they end up with about 8 gold coins per lizard. Even so, it's a lot of money. Ivan is overwhelmed thinking about how he will use all of this. Then, Espada brings terrible news, saying that when a village earns more than 100 gold coins, it has to pay half to the Marquis as tax. Van feels as if he has lost all his life savings in a cryptocurrency scam. Hearing this, he asks if there is any way to commit tax evasion. Espada tells him that there's no way to hide the sale of such a large quantity of materials, and Van loses all hope. Still, what worries him most is the fact that his father might discover the importance of that village, because if that happens, he will be exiled to some distant place. Suddenly, Espada has an idea and says that they can bypass the situation by reporting everything to Muria instead of Jalpa. Van realizes that they can credit the defeat of the lizards to his older brother, which would cover their actions and allow them to stay in that village longer. The next day, 2 merchants arrive at the village and are completely flabbergasted to see the enormous wall resembling a fortress in front of them. They start blaming each other for reading Google Maps wrong and getting lost on the way. Suddenly, Van appears atop the gate and welcomes them to his village. The merchants are shocked to recognize him as the genius son of the Marquis and wonder why he is in such a remote place. They introduce themselves as Bell and Rango from the Merry Chamber of Commerce. Ivan allows them in as soon as the merchant brothers arrive at the warehouse. Their mouths drop open at the sight of the materials collected from the armored lizards. They find it hard to believe that such a small village could have hunted all those monsters, but Van only wants to know if they can buy all of it. The merchants immediately respond that they can and ask Van to wait a month, as they need to organize a whole team to assess and transport everything. Van agrees and asks them to take some meat for free, since it's going to rot anyway, as he still can't create a refrigerator. Then he asks the brothers to take a look at some weapons that are also for sale, and they are amazed by the quality. They accept Van's asking price without even trying to negotiate, and he asks them to promote them. The brothers hesitate to respond, and Van realizes that these newbies think they are professionals capable of monopolizing the trade of their swords. He tells them that even if they try to keep everything a secret, people will eventually discover the village, as they can trace the route they use. The brothers are shocked to hear this. Even says there's another way for them to make absurd profits. They are eager to know what it is, and he suggests that they open a shop within the village. The brothers immediately accept the proposal and bow to Van in gratitude. He then says that they should build the shop immediately, even before fully understanding what he meant. Van creates the shop they have always dreamed of and says he hopes to do great business with them. Shortly after, Van receives 2 guests he didn't expect at all. One is a young noblewoman, almost the same age as him, and the other is a tough knight with a warrior mom aura protecting her. The knight arrives full of judgments and declares that she will find out if Van is truly a genius or a fraud. Meanwhile, Van is receiving a homework assignment about swordsmanship that tells him to plan a city capable of housing 10,000 people, because at the rate the village is developing, it will soon become a city. The sword asks what kind of fortress city Van desires, noting that square-shaped fortresses are the most common. However, Van struggles to be discreet and states that he wants to build a star-shaped fortress, as this would force attackers to waste a lot of time dealing with the defensive points scattered around the fortress. The sword likes the idea and begins to help him with the design. At that moment, the red-haired knight bursts into the room, announcing that an emissary from the neighboring county of Ferdinando has come to see him. Van allows them to enter and discovers that it is indeed the young noble and the knight. "Hello, ladies," he greets them, and the knight introduces herself as Panamera, who became a vice-countess after rising from the rank of knight. The girl nervously introduces herself as Arte, the youngest daughter of Count Fernando IV. Van invites them both to sit down. Panamera immediately asks why Van thinks they are there, and he replies that they came to assess him and try to win him over should he seem like a threat. Panamera bursts out laughing upon hearing this, as Van hit the nail on the head, and then explains that Count Ferdinando believes that Marquis Halpa sent his genius son to govern that village as part of a plan to conquer his territory. However, Panamera thinks that Van was sent there because he lacks elemental magic. Van decides to be honest and says that she is right about the lack of elemental magic, but he is not there to lead any war. He was simply exiled by his father. Panamera refuses to believe this. After seeing how much Van has developed the village in such a short time, she begins to believe that about 5,000 soldiers were sent with him to turn the village into a military base. Van bursts out laughing upon hearing this and then apologizes, explaining that he was expelled from his family with only his luggage and his calmness, and that no one even came to say goodbye to him. Panamera then asks if she is hallucinating at seeing the butler and the vice commander of the knights there. Dai replies that he came on his own to complete Van's training, and that he ignored the messages from the commander of the knights asking him to return to the capital. The sword also mentions that it has retired and is now teaching. Van has a hobby, besides asserting that he wants to serve Van forever, as he treats everyone with kindness, regardless of social class. Still, this does not explain the accelerated development of the village. So, Van decides to give a demonstration to the guests, as it would be quicker. He takes them outside the village and asks Espada to create an earthen wall so that he can transform it into a fortification-level wall. Panamera is impressed by the old butler's magic, but she says that the wall will crumble as soon as it loses its structure. Immediately, Van uses his magic to turn the mud wall into solid concrete and then uses wooden nanocubes to create a gate. Panamera and Arte are completely stunned to see this and ask what Van's magical attribute is. He replies that he can use production magic, considered the worst type of magic, and that was exactly why he was exiled to that place. Hearing this, Arte remembers her own unhappy life, and then Panamera decides to move on to her second objective. She tells Van that she was sent there to offer Arte's hand in marriage, and he understands that the Count wants to hand over his daughter to ensure that Van does not try to conquer his territory. Van responds that a marriage is unnecessary, as he does not want to conflict with anyone, and is only developing the village because he wishes to live a peaceful life in that place. Panamera says that at first, she wanted to prevent Arte from being promised to the lord of a nameless, small village, as she believed that she would not find happiness in such a precarious place. However, after seeing Van's potential and character, she starts to support the marriage. Panamera begins to praise his intelligence, charisma, and the willpower to turn difficulties into challenges, even going so far as to say that if it were legal, she herself would like to marry him. Van gets excited about the idea of having a mommy waifu, but unfortunately, for now, he can only be with Arte. Panamera then turns to Arte and asks if she wants to marry Van, sincerely stating that she cannot imagine a better man than him. Arte becomes shy and replies that Van is a good person, but has not yet thought about marriage. Van also tells her to take as much time as she needs, because this is the most important decision of her life, Panamera. So she says they will spend the night in the village to think it over. Van is shocked to learn that they will be staying there, but when Panamera asks if he has a spare room in any mansion, Van decides to build an inn specially for them. After that, they have dinner together, and Van decides to get to know better the girl who might become his future waifu. Arte shares that she likes cute things like flowers and dolls, and Van asks if he can see the dolls she has. Arte is happy that someone is interested in her and eagerly agrees to show the dolls that are in her carriage. Later, Van accompanies the two to the inn. Panamera leaves the two young people alone so that Arte can tell Van that he is a good person before running off to her own room, embarrassed. Van then returns to his mansion, where Espada comments that since the Count sent his own daughter to marry the lord of a nameless village, it is quite likely that she is also not an elemental mage. He finally realizes that Arte has also been exiled from home and decides he will let her live in the village, should she want to, even if they do not get engaged. The next day, Tio and Kanchim wake Van up in a panic, saying it is an emergency. Even Dee and Espada have raced to the site. Van is quite confused as he has just woken up, and Tio explains to him that days ago he created the village lake, which was named Lake Van. On the way to the lake, Van asks why. The lake bears his name. Tio explains that the villagers were happy about the creation of the lake and named it so that future generations would never forget who created it. Kanchim adds that the villagers also want to name the place Village Van, but Van asks them not to do that. Upon arriving at the lake, Dai comes to meet him. Van asks what is happening, and Dai shows him a kind of mermaid in the lake. Espada explains that it is an apkaruru, a semi-human half-fish. They live in a beautiful river in the forest, but for some reason they still do not understand. They are here in the lake that Van created. Despite being an uncommon species, they are rarely seen by humans. Ivan tries to communicate with her, but he can't help but think that maybe she doesn't understand the human language. He asks his uncle to bring some meat. When offering the food, it works. She starts to approach, and when she gets close, she asks if she can eat the meat. Van confirms, and upon biting into it, she finds it very good and asks what it is. Van says it's armored lizard meat, and that, if she wants to come back to eat, he can offer her dried meat from then on. She asks who defeated the armored lizard, and everyone in the village starts to say it was Van. At that moment, she swims back to the water, and Van wonders if she will return again. The sword says it is a rare kind and that it shouldn't appear for a long time, but he was wrong because the next day not only did she appear, but her entire clan did. Kanchim wonders if this has anything to do with the defeat of the armored lizards. Van asks the sword if the armored lizards are some kind of gods to the Apkarurus because he is afraid they might seek Revenge. The butler says he has never heard of anything like that. The leader then tells Van that he would like to speak with him. Van thinks the leader's eyes are frightening. The leader thanks Van for helping his daughter and says he heard that he defeated the armored lizards. Van confirms, and the entire clan is shocked that a child managed such a feat. When Van begins to explain that he did not do it alone, the leader of the Apkaruris suddenly says he accepts Van's marriage to his daughter, Lada, Priora, which frightens our protagonist. Vesta asks if he is dissatisfied, as Priora is his only daughter, who in the future will become a beautiful adult woman who will shine like a jewel. Van thinks she is still a child who does not understand something like marriage very well, and asks if there is any reason to talk about this. The leader explains that the clan has lived to this day without any contact with humans, but in recent years, the armored lizards began to invade the place where they lived, and many in their species did not survive. For this reason, they are looking for a strong husband for Priora, as they want to ensure a place where they can live in peace. Even understands that he wants strong allies, and that for this reason, he is offering his daughter's hand in marriage. He explains that, in that case, she does not need to marry him, that she can grow up and choose who they want to marry in the future, and that even without marriage, he is willing to protect them. He sees this question. Will he really do that? And can they live there? Van confirms, saying he will start building immediately and creates 2 houses by the river for them. Vesta is shocked by his magic, and Van explains that it is a resting area and they can feel free to use it. Uncle and Cantum add that it is very spacious, so it will be relaxing for them, and that even on days of the heavy rain, nothing will happen, as it is quite sturdy. Sometime later, all the Apkaruris are relaxing at the site. Espada tells Van that it's time to deal with the sewage. He sees this question. What will he do? Van explains that he installed several sewage pipes under the constructions of the village and that the well water is periodically dumped into the facilities for sewage treatment. Vesta understands and says they will help, as they are good at underwater work. Soon after, we see Canteem opening the facility door with the help of the Apkaruris. Ivan thanks them for their help, and the leader asks if he does this work every day. Admitting that he does, the leader comments that he would like to take care of the sewage treatment as a way of gratitude for letting them live there. At this moment, Panamera and Alt arrive at the site. Seeing the Apkaruris, Panamera is shocked, as it is very rare to see them. At that moment, Vesta calls Van's son-in-law and thanks him for his generous hospitality. Alt is shocked by the word son-in-law, and Panamera asks what that means. When Van tries to deny it, Priora introduces herself as Van's wife and bids farewell, calling him husband, leaving him in hot water. Later, we see Van and Alt in a boat. He apologizes for the morning incident, and she says it's all right, that she loves the fresh air there because it gives a good feeling, and that Panamera has already explained the misunderstanding to her. Alt says that he created a lake and developed the village so much, and that is incredible. Van replies that this is thanks to everyone who works hard. At that moment, Priora appears calling Van husband. She asks who the girl with him is, and Alt introduces herself. Several Apkaruru children appear and start rocking the boat, making Alta fall with her hands in vain, which infuriates Priora. She approaches them and asks if everything is all right with her husband. Ivan explains that he spoke with her father and that they are not married. Priora then dives into the lake and leaves. The children start rocking the boat even more as punishment for hurting Priora. When they leave the lake, Vista approaches Van and says that she has told him everything. Then, this man imposes himself quite a bit, telling Van that he already has his daughter, and on top of that, is still flirting with another. Alta is taken aback, thinking he is talking about her, and Van tries to explain again. But out of nowhere, the beast says that they will have a duel. He wants Van to face his clan. If they win, he will formally accept the marriage with his daughter, which is obviously a big hassle for Van. The worst part is that suddenly, Dia appears saying that they accept the challenge. According to Dia, everything is in their hands, and he will ensure victory. Espada also agrees to the duel because if this is resolved quickly, he can finally focus on his studies. For Panamera, this is also interesting, although Van feels it is dangerous, as if they lose, he will have to marry. Still, his people are very determined, so the beast says that the decision will be best of 3. The first trial is up to Van, who has a pretty interesting idea. It's basically a game of volleyball, but in the water. To allow them to participate, Van Nee creates bikinis for Panamera and the others, who are very happy with the outfits. She wants to participate and actually wants to win because she knows Van would have to marry Alte. Thus, the game begins. Panamera teams up with Uncle, while the Beast teams up with his daughter. The game starts, but they lose very quickly. Priora and the Beast are too agile and strong for this this kind of game. They start to really thrash poor Uncle's team, and everything begins to get quite complicated. Uncle even starts to cry because the situation overwhelms him. Then, they decide to fight again. Very motivated, they start to move better until they finally score their first point. They continue fiercely until they tie, and then the decisive point arrives. Panamera tries to block the attack, but even so, they end up losing. The uncle starts to cry again, but according to Panamera, this is just the beginning of their legend. Even though they lost, the next challenge will be chosen by Besta, and he begins to explain it. The challenge will basically be a swimming duel, a relay race in pairs. Clearly, they have the advantage, which worries Van, as this way he will end up having to marry Priora. But Dai says there's no problem, and that he'll handle it. Kamshin is also confident he can manage, so they become the candidates for this challenge. With that decided, Kamshin faces Priora. She moves too quickly, and Kamshin can barely catch up to her, but very stubbornly, he starts to push himself and ends up getting close. Priora then enters the water and swims even faster, reaching the exchange point. A few seconds later, Kanchim also arrives and shoots off like a bullet. Van wonders why he swims in butterfly style, and his friends explain that's how he trains. The good thing is that it works really well, because he moves super fast and ends up winning the race. But then a problem arises. While Dai was celebrating, she didn't notice that her bikini had fallen down. Besta never thought they would lose in swimming, but there is still one last challenge, and he decides to give this final test to his son-in-law. Thinking hard about his strategy, he comes up with a strange idea. He creates a snow cone machine, and they will use magic to produce the ice. He finishes the snow cone, adds various flavors, and it turns out very pretty, but Panamera asks what it will be used for. According to our protagonist, this is the competition, a duel of slushies. It will be a pair competition, and he will also participate. Therefore, Alt decides to support him, although the others have their doubts. In fact, already in the middle of the competition, she is also unsure of what she can do, but she decides to believe in herself and starts the challenge. They eat as fast as they can, but their brains begin to freeze. Still, Besta needs to keep going for his daughter, so he continues to push through. Van was honestly almost ready to give up, but looking to the side and seeing how hard Alt is trying, decide not to be left behind. He gathers strength from wherever he can and starts eating a lot. They eat and eat and eat without stopping until the contest ends. The winning duo was our protagonist and Alt, which means the victory belongs to Van. Being very noble, Besta approaches to congratulate him. Van feels happy, thinking that the engagement issue is resolved, but Besta says he likes his son-in-law even more now. He is definitely the ideal man for his daughter, and after that, he just bids farewell, saying he entrusts his daughter to him. In the end, winning meant nothing because Prior is also very happy with her future husband. At that moment, our protagonist's stomach begins to hurt from having eaten too much ice, but at least everyone is very happy because they had a lot of fun with this contest. Alta notices this. All the people around Van laugh a lot, and she wishes she could be like that too, but doesn't know how to achieve it. Since she was born, her father had always been so busy that he barely saw her. Her mother left her with a nanny and also didn't seem to care for her. The reason was simple. They considered her a failure. She was timid, sensitive, and didn't do well in her studies. She also had no special talents. The only thing she possessed was puppet magic. When she manipulated them, it was as if she could move them with more freedom than her own body. She thought that with this, she could make her mother happy, but she ended up being considered a disgrace to the family. It was then that she discovered that, among nobles, puppet magic is viewed as something evil and detestable. From then on, everyone stopped talking to her to the point that she felt invisible. When she was 10 years old, her father ordered her to marry a certain man. On that day, she was insecure and very scared, but the young Ben turned out to be very kind. His aptitude was not the magic of the 4 elements, but rather production magic, which was also considered inferior. Nonetheless, he exudes confidence and talent and uses his cards positively. For that reason, she believes that if she hadn't stopped practicing magic back then, it could have changed her life. Still, now she decides to try much harder. After a while, Van wants to continue developing the village and go back to working on the wall. He tells the villagers to work carefully and not to get hurt. Everyone feels very motivated, especially because the next day they will have a day off and today there will be a big barbecue. Panamera finds it curious to see how much he motivates them. Van apologizes for being so informal, but that's just how he is. It is then that Alt appears. She starts the conversation, wishes him good morning, and tries to strike up a chat. Van immediately notices that she seems more cheerful than usual. According to her, she feels full of energy, and inside, she thinks that, little by little, she wants to see the same landscape that Mr. Van sees. She wants to get closer to him. Therefore, she asks if she can watch how they work, and of course, he sees no problem with that. However, taking a quick look at the adventurers, it seems there is no time to relax. And well, here we wrap up today's video. Comment the word duel so I know you made it to the end.